Hello, students and teachers. Today I'm going to give you a lecture on the global economy. Hopefully through this lecture you will understand how the whole globe is connected through this economic system and the country where you're living, how your economy relates to the economy of the USA, China, and Korea. So let's look at some of these issues. Why is it important for you to understand the global economy? First of all, you have to understand what is the impact of the coronavirus on your economy today. And then you also have to understand what is the impact of this rivalry between US and China. It started from like a trade conflict, but it's being expanded into other areas. Thirdly, all of you know the importance of the dollar, and very often you have people spending the dollar when the tourists come to your country. So you have to understand exchange rates. Some of the students who are from Central Asia will realize that the price of oil is also very important for your economy. So you have to understand oil price. And then eventually you will have to, hopefully you have to make investments when you grow up and earn more money. And also look for a job, what kind of areas are very promising. So all of these things I think I will try to address in my lecture. So first let's look at the flow of products and capital in the world. So you can see here that, you can see that China and the US, and then China with other emerging economies with Russia for Central Asian countries. And how are all these things connected? First of all, if you look at the flow from the emerging economies to China, you can see that mostly like commodities are exported to China. So maybe some food like wheat, coffee, or maybe oil or iron ore. These are things that you get from the earth. Okay, these are called commodities, are exported from emerging economies into China. Now what does China do? China uses these raw materials to make products, like chairs and TVs and smartphones, and they export all of these, like, made in China is so popular all over the world, right? To developing economies like the US and Europe. So what about the flow from the US to China? If you look at from the US to China, mostly it's money, investments. So all these developed economies, what they do is they go into the emerging economies and they invest money. So this is the whole flow, okay? And of course, so the most important players is emerging economy, USA and China. Okay. But there are also what is called the regional strongholds. Like in the former Soviet Union, Russian economy is very important because all the Central Asian countries trade a lot with Russia. So we need to understand some of these regional flows as well. So this is the total flow of money and resources and products in the world. So you can see they're all connected. Now, many of you know about what is GDP, right? We all know what is GDP. How does a country develop their GDP? I'm sure you're all very interested to know how can my country become a rich country and do better. So GDP consists of three things. One is investments, the other one is export, and the third is consumption. So these are the three main components. So if you look at a country like China, how did China grow their GDP? Mainly through exports, right? China. Made in China is everywhere. Right? And also to a certain extent, now China will grow their economy through consumption because the Chinese is a big market. It's the biggest market in the world for many products. How about United States? United States, they don't export that much. Mostly United States is consumption. United States is a consumption-driven economy. So how can a country become so rich just by spending money, you may say, right? This consumption is just spending money. Well, it's possible in the United States because the U.S. has what is called the reserve currency. U.S. dollar dominates the global economy. So if your currency can dominate the global economy, then you can become a strong economy just by consumption. How about Korea? Obviously for Korea is exports. We don't have that much investments or consumption. We have a very small population. We're mostly through exports, like Korean cars, like Hyundai, Kia, and Samsung and LG. So you can see Korea is export driven. Now let's look at two emerging economies of, let's say, Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan. Kazakhstan, they're both in Central Asia. Kazakhstan grew mainly through exports of oil. But as you know, oil prices are not so high these days and it fluctuates very widely. So the Kazakhstan economy is very much dependent on oil. This is the same for the Russian economy. And maybe also for some economies in Southeast Asia, it's oil-producing nations like Malaysia and Indonesia. And Uzbekistan is different. Uzbekistan doesn't have a lot of oil. They grew through investments. So this is a different strategy. They're neighboring countries with very different strategies. Before, when oil prices were high, Kazakh economy was much better. But now, because oil prices are much lower, Uzbek economy is doing much better. So we will see how these things are going to play out. So I'm just going to skip this. These are different type of investments. And so let's look at the global economy in 2021. Now, in 2020, last year, the global economy had a minus 3.3 because, as you all know, because of COVID. Now, what is kind of a standard for, is this a good economy or a bad economy? The standard is, if it's between 3 to 3.5% growth, then it's deemed to be okay. If it's below 3%, then it's deemed to be poor. We're going to have a recession. If it goes beyond 3.5, it's a very booming economy. So this year is 6.0, but this 6.0 is just a rebound, right? Because if you minus the 3.3 that we lost last year, in a sense, this is just a net gain of 2.7, right? So 2.7 is not good, right? In a way, so this year it's okay, but it's not good. What is the main driver of the global economy? You know, before the global economy used to expand at 6%, but recently only 3%. Why? Well, because the population growth has slowed a lot. Because the population growth is actually was the main driver of the global economy. Anyway, to understand the global economy, you have to understand just a few things. First, you have to understand how good is Chinese economy, because if the Chinese economy is good, then what happens is it pulls up all the emerging economies too, because emerging economies make money from selling commodities to China, like oil or steel, wheat, coffee, and so on. So the Chinese economy has to be good to pull the global economy. The US economy also has to be good because the US economy buys products from China. So Chinese economy, US economy, these are the two key economies you should understand. Another, you should understand what is the exchange rate, the dollar, especially for your country, you know. Now, I remember I was once traveling in Kazakhstan, and right after I left the country, the American dollar value doubled 100, so it doubled, so it went up by 100% in 1 week. So I felt that if I stayed a little bit longer there, I can spend more because I went there with my dollars, right? But so depending on the exchange rate, you can make a lot of money or you can lose a lot of money doing business in your country, okay? So you have to understand exchange rates. And fourthly, you have to understand the price of oil, because this affects lots of other many economies, and maybe not just oil, but commodities in general. But amongst all the commodities, a commodity doesn't mean like a product. Commodity is a specialized term in finance. It's raw materials. It's called a commodity. Okay. So these are the four things you should understand: U.S. economy, Chinese economy, exchange rate, and oil prices. But of course, we know that last year, the biggest driver was the COVID, right? But this is a very extraordinary phenomenon. It's not going to recur. So now people say, well, maybe the health system can be a very important component of the country's economic well-being. So I'm just going to skip this slide because I'm going to talk more about individual economies later on, and from where the students are coming from. So I'll talk about economies of maybe Thailand, and Vietnam, and Kyrgyzstan, and so on. Okay. So I'm going to skip this, and here these are the projections for this year, and you can see like this yellow line is the expected growth of the economy. But then there are two other dotted lines. One is a blue dotted line and the one is a red one, right? The blue one is what's going to happen if the COVID is controlled. And the red one is what will happen if the COVID is not controlled. So nobody knows, right? Because now with the COVID Delta virus, it seems more likely that we're going to do the red one rather than the green dotted line. So let's look at the impact of COVID in all the key metrics. So if you look at the first chart here, you can see household spending. And household spending is you can see here is all very, very low, right? There's a lot of minus here. And then also if you look at in terms of the spending, the differences. So we have here, these are the minus spendings. So in terms of travel and like restaurants and concerts and performing is huge, it's minus, right? But there has also been some plus during the COVID, like home appliances and grocery foods. Because people cannot eat outside in the restaurant, they have to cook at home. So they have to buy more grocery foods. And because people stay more at home, they want to have a better place, they buy more furniture, they buy more TV, appliances, and so on. So you can see that some of them has been plus here. Okay? But generally there's more minus. So because of the drop in household spending, there's also a drop in industrial production. You can see that production is also dropping. And also in trade. So generally the COVID has a very negative effect of minus 3.3. Of course we will go back plus 6%, but as I said, if you discount the minus 3 net compared to 2019 is just 2.7% growth, which is not that high. So let's see how the governments respond to COVID. And you can see what can the government do when the COVID. One is they can give money to the people, right? So they give money to each person gets $1,000 and so on. So this is one way. Second is they can lend money to companies and business people at low rate. Thirdly, the government can increase other spending. They can maybe do more construction projects and they can build roads. They spend more. It's called the super budget, you know. Every country is spending more because they want to boost up the economy because the household spending is down, so they have to make up for that with government spending. But if the government spends so much money, then what happens? The government goes into debt, right? So you can see that Japan has been very, very high in terms of, as a percent of the GDP, Japan spent around 15%. Government increased their spending 15% of the GDP, and Italy 12% and so on, but Korea only 5%. So which means that the Korean government has managed this COVID better than other countries, right? It's very easy to boost up the economy by spending more, but what happens if you spend more? You have to tax people more in the future. But I think in Korea has been managed very well in this regard. Some countries like Indonesia, I don't know if we have some students from Indonesia, but they have too much debt because they want to boost the economy. So the debt is very high, so the government have to borrow money at a very high rate. Governments are just like people. If you are in good financial position, you borrow at a lower rate. If you are in a bad position, you have to borrow at a much higher rate. Okay, so now let's go to, so this is very similar, so I'm just going to skip this one. So let's look at public health. What I found very interesting, this is a table made by Johns Hopkins University in the United States. And they look at the overall score of public health in the world. And you can see that number 1 is United States, number 2 is United Kingdom, number 3 is Netherlands, Australia, and so on. So generally, the developed countries have a good public health, right? But among the emerging countries, surprisingly, the highest is Thailand. So Thailand has managed this very well, and South Korea is number 9, so overall. And then you can also look at it by categories. One is prevention of COVID. Second is early response, early detection and response. How do you, like testing and so on? And then also early response to the treatment. So if you look at these 3 categories, you can see, again, all the top countries are the developed countries here, but you can see very often South Korea, Thailand appearing many, many times. But there's 2 different stories about Thailand and South Korea. You know, South Korea economy did very well during the COVID, right? But the Thailand economy did very poorly during the COVID. And you may ask, why? Oh, they have such nice public health. Why the economy is so bad? Well, because Thailand economy is heavily dependent on tourism. Up to 30% of the GDP is tourism related. So even though they have healthy countries, they don't have tourists to travel to that country, so they're hit very high. But this is very promising for Thailand. I know we have many students from Thailand too, because you are doing a very good job with the public health system there. And so these are the things I'm just want to mention, that having a good public health system also means your economy will be strong and resilient to many of these attacks by these viruses in the future. Okay, so now let me switch from COVID and talk about the US-China trade conflict. And as you know, USA and China are the 2 superpowers, right? And what happens in the world when there is 2 superpowers? Let's suppose, like in the Wild Kingdom, there are 2 very strong lions. What happens when there are 2 very strong male lions? They eventually have to fight. They have to fight, and they have to determine who is the winner, right? And now the Chinese economy is around 70% of the US economy. So Chinese, many people predict that within about 15 years, the Chinese economy will be bigger than the US economy. So US feels threatened, right? US and the Western world feels. That's why we have this trade conflict. Because if you have these superpowers colliding, then there's going to be like some conflict. When will the conflict end? When does the fight end? Usually after one person wins, right? A fight usually doesn't end by, okay, let's stop fighting, let's be nice to each other. No, that doesn't happen. What happens? a fight usually finishes if one person wins and the other person loses. So this is what we can forecast in the future. Either US will win or China will win. Right? So if you look at US-China trade conflict, it started from 2016 here. At this time, you see the Chinese made huge investments in the United States. They bought many American companies, American real estate and so on. But since the conflict is decreased dramatically, right? And also the US used to make large investments in China, but that's also declined after 2018. So this is putting a real downward pressure on the global economy. If you look at goods trade with China, you can also see that Americans export, this is the export, and this is the import. Export very little, but they import a lot. So there's a big trade imbalance between China and the United States. But you can see even the imports are shrinking here. This is because of the US-China trade conflict. So let's look at, but this is not only affecting United States and China. As I said, the whole global, we saw the flow of capital and flow of money and flow of commodities is affecting all other countries. Since the US trade conflict, you can see that United Kingdom, Germany, Japan, all are going down. All the exports are going down. And this is because of the US-China trade conflict. And also look at the production. This is even before the COVID. You can see that Germany, Japan, United Kingdom, they're all going down because of the US-China trade conflict. Now we have to see, look at some geopolitics in this region. And of course, this chart has changed a little bit, I think. You can see that the blue are the countries which are kind of pro-United States, right? This is what's called the Quad. Remember the Quad? Which are the Quad? America, Japan, Australia, and India. So these four very large powers are pro-American. They're in the American camp. Whereas countries like Pakistan, Cambodia, Laos, and Malaysia are viewed as pro-China, right? Pro-China. Now this is we have what is called the balance theory in psychology. If I have a friend, this is me, this is my friend, and a friend of my friend. A friend of a friend is a friend, right? Or how about an enemy of my friend? If someone is an enemy of your friend, it means the enemy of your friend is your enemy also, right? Also, your enemy of an enemy is a friend. So we have this kind of interpersonal relationship going on in amongst people. This is called the balance theory in psychology. This also happens in geopolitics. So for example, like India is on very bad terms with China. And India is on very bad terms with Pakistan. So Pakistan is friendly with China because China is an enemy of an enemy, right? So because of these things, you can see Pakistan is China. But how about Vietnam? Let's look at Vietnam, for example. Vietnam has always been hostile with China because there's a lot of border conflict, right? So Vietnam is a friend with the United States because China is now conflict with the United States, so Vietnam is a friend of the United States. So of course there's these countries like Myanmar now became more pro-Chinese because the Chinese government is the only government that supports the military dictatorship in Myanmar recently, right? And Korea is classified as pro-America. Even though we have more trade with China, and China is much closer, we are militarily more dependent on the US. So this is the balance of power. So for many Asian countries, like all of you are from Asian countries, China is a big trading partner, but Do you want to be friends with China, or do you want to be friends with United States? United States may be a little bit more far away, but China being close also becomes a more threat, right? Because of the border. India-China border, the Japan-China fight over the South Indian Ocean, right? The Senkaku Islands. Philippines also fight with China with these islands in the South China Sea. Vietnam also fighting with China. We're very fortunate not to fight with China over the land because we have North Korea as a buffer. Otherwise, we could have some problems too, right? So you can see, we see this big clash between China and the United States. But you can see still, this is the military spending of the United States, and this the red one is military spending of China. America spends 3 times more on military than the Chinese. So potentially, America is still militarily a much bigger superpower than China. But if you look at the economy, this is the American economy in the blue line, but the Chinese economy is catching up very quickly. So if you see this trajectory, now America is about 1.36 times. In about 15 years, it will be the same, right? But then afterwards, we'll see whether what's going to happen in the future. It's very difficult for a country like Korea because we have to look at China with one eye and look at the United States with the other eye. Okay, now let's look at, to understand the global economy, look at the exchange rate. Exchange rate is extremely important, you know. Once I bought a car in America, because I had some money I took from Korea when I visited America, when I was living for 1 year in America, teaching there, I bought a car with Korean money, and at that time the Korean currency was quite good. After 1 year, we had this Asian financial crisis. So after I used the car, I resold the car in dollars and brought the money back to Korea. The value doubled because during the Asian financial crisis, we call it the IMF in Korea, the Korean won dropped by 100%. So it's very important to understand exchange rate, especially in the emerging economies. And so, like water just has one flow. Water flows from high to low. So water just has one. But money has 2 types of flows. So if you understand the flow, where is the money coming from, you can be waiting there and you can earn money. And so water has one flow, but money has 2 flows. One is A. A is your money flows from the low yield to high yield. So if, like for example, in Korea, the interest rate is about 3%, but in Southeast Asia, interest rate is about 8%. So many Korean banks send money to Southeast Asia. The money is flowing because from the low interest rate, low yield, to high yield. So this is one flow. But there is also a second flow. And the second flow is this. Money also wants to be safe. You want to go from risky, if this is risky, you want to put your money in a safe place, right? If putting money at your house is very risky, you want to put your money in a bank. So this the flow A and flow B goes opposite because flow A is from Europe to emerging economies. Whereas flow B means from emerging economies to Europe, right? So depending on this flow, so as I said, water has one flow, but money has 2 flows, and it goes back and forth. So you have to time everything very, very well. Okay? So what determines this? Is it going to be A or B? For example, today, right now today, is it A or B? What do you think? Well, today, the money is B. Money is coming out of, let's say, emerging economies like Indonesia, Central Asia, and going to Europe and the United States. What happens when this occurs? these emerging economies are in very, very big trouble, right? Because suddenly all the dollars went out, and it's even possible that they would be insolvent, like bankrupt, country bankruptcy. But what about like 3 years ago, before COVID? Before COVID, money flow was A. The developing countries were sending money to the emerging economies because it gives higher interest. And they feel this global system is safe. If the global system is safe, money always goes to the emerging economies, right? If the global system is unstable, all the money goes back to USA or Europe. But what happens during A? Let's look at A. Okay, so about 3 years ago, most of the money was going into the Southeast Asia and Latin America, Africa, and so on. What happens when it's A? Always there's lots of money being poured into these countries, more money than you need. What happens if you have more money than you need? People buy land, people buy houses. So you have this kind of a bubble. You have a real estate bubble. Whenever lots of money, when A happens, there's a real estate bubble. Now, I remember I was in Myanmar about 5 years ago, and so much money is coming into Myanmar. And the real estate in Yangon is so expensive. I thought, is this Yangon or is this Seoul? Okay. Even Vietnam, just 3 years ago, real estate prices just skyrocket in Hanoi. But now it's different story, right? Because the COVID money is going out of these countries. So you have to know this flow. And there's I just explained this. One index that determines where it's flowing is this called the CBOE. This is from the Chicago, I think Board of Exchange. And here they have what's called the Volatility Index. So this tells you how unstable this economy is, right? So if you look at here, like between 2002 and 2008, it has been very, very low. Average was like 16.1%. I mean, here. So when this is very low, what happens, as I said, when this is very low, the flow is A. All the money is going into the developed, like Indonesia or China and so on. How about global financial crisis? Volatility is very high, very unstable. What happens? All the money went into the United States. All the money, including Korea. All the money from Korea even went to the United States. And then we have these various smaller crises, right? Smaller crises. So whenever you have a crisis, people are going to take money out of your country and bring it back to the United States because that's where the safe place is. And here you can see the US-China trade war also created a lot of instability, right? And in 2020, COVID. What happened in COVID? With COVID, Southeast Asian currency devalued by about 30%, right after COVID. So think about that, suddenly you lost 30% of your national wealth in dollar terms. But now, when COVID became a little bit better, the Southeast Asian currency went back up. But now with the Delta, virus, is becoming unstable again. So we'll have to see how that goes. So every country wants to prevent the risk, right? We want to prevent the risk of a bankruptcy. Just as a single person wants to prevent bankruptcy risk, a country wants to prevent bankruptcy risk. So what determines the bankruptcy risk is how much dollar you have in your central bank, right? If you don't have enough dollar to pay, then you become bankrupt. But one country in the world can never be bankrupt. Which country is this? It's the US. Because they have to pay dollar, the American government can just print more money. American government can print more money. So American can never be bankrupt. So this is the benefit of having a reserve currency. You can expand your economy without the risk of bankruptcy. What is another benefit of being a reserve currency? One is the exchange rate. You don't have to exchange. So if for example, I'm a Korean, I want to invest in Thailand, what can I do? First, I have to change my money to US dollar, and then after US dollar, change the US dollar to Thailand baht. So I have to pay the exchange twice, Korea to US, US to Thailand. But for Americans, they just have to pay the exchange just once, from dollar to baht, right? So even though if I go to Japan, maybe you think I'm just exchanging Korean and Japanese money. No, I have to first exchange with American dollar, and then from American dollar exchange with Japan. So Americans also make lots of benefit because in international investment, they don't have to pay so much in the exchange rate. But so constantly the Chinese, I talked about confidence, Chinese say, okay, we can become the global reserve currency, yuan. We will become, or euro, but they both are failed. Why the yuan failed? Because not many people trust the integrity of the Chinese financial institution, because it's government controlled, right? Why the euro? Because euro is composed of too many countries, so they cannot make up their mind exactly what kind of policy they want to do. So for the time being, US dollar will become the only reserve currency. Now, if you want to ask what other things are kind of constant across the world, there's only one more thing. One is dollar, the other one is gold. So people who really want to make a safe investment, they either buy the dollar or they buy gold. Okay, so for the sake of time, I'm going to go a little bit faster. So the U.S. economy this year is 6.4% forecasted. Last year was not good, minus 3.5. But in general, the U.S. economy is quite strong. Why? Because they have a very strong spending. As I said, GDP consists of investment, export, and consumption, right? And you can see this is the historical GDP growth and consumption growth. So in America, GDP growth and consumption growth goes side by side. And I said this because US is a reserve currency, so they don't have to worry about debt. This is why American economy is strong. But they also have a very strong IT sector, like Google, Apple, Netflix, and so on. So in general, American economy is very strong. Now, let's look at the Chinese economy. The big factor of Chinese economy, you can see right before COVID, is that the growth rate is coming down. Right? The growth rate is going down in China. Why? Because the exports cannot grow as fast. Investment is also quite slow. Why? Because look at China. In 2019, China per capita GDP is 10,000. So before, people went to China because China's labor is cheap. Chinese labor is cheap. So you go to China, you build a factory, it's very cheap. But now, Chinese is so expensive. China GDP is 10,000. Oh, let's go to Myanmar, 1,300. Or let's go to Vietnam. Okay? So now, factories are moving out of China, going mostly to Vietnam. So this is why the Vietnamese economy is so strong. Even with the COVID, Vietnam economy had a plus. And factories are moving from China to Vietnam for another reason. Because of the US-China conflict. US put a lot of restriction on imports from China, so factories are also now moving to Vietnam. As you know, the Samsung smartphone factory are all now in Vietnam. They moved from China to Vietnam. Also, Samsung Semiconductor, many of the new factories are being built in Vietnam. But what is next? Maybe it can be Myanmar, but Myanmar has such a bad political system now that people will not invest there, right? So anyway, basically the Chinese growth is slowing. So this can be a potential problem for China. Another important aspect of the Chinese economy is the Silk Road economic belt, which started in 2015. Because, as I said, China's exports growth is dropping, foreign investment is dropping, so they need to find something to boost their economy. And one of the things they're doing is the Silk Road economic belt. Of course, hopefully this will help benefit both the receiving countries as well as China, but there are lots of issues to be solved. So now next we go to the Russian economy. The Russian economy is heavily dependent on oil and gas. About 20% of the GDP is dependent on oil and gas. So if the oil prices are strong, if it's like above $80 or $90, Russian economy is strong. But if it's below like $70, $60, then the Russian economy is going to be in big trouble. And they had many, many years of recession in Russia because of oil prices. What determines oil price? One big determinant is the presence of shale oil. It's called the sand oil, getting oil from the sand in USA and Canada, as well as China. There is reported that there is more oil in the sand than oil in the wells. So when oil prices go up, US and Canadian companies increase production of shale oil. This brings down the cost of oil, the price of oil. So whenever it goes up, they supply more, so it comes down. Whenever it tries to go up, supply more, it comes down. So many people project that oil cannot in the long run be more than even $60. Of course, there will be times when it goes beyond 60. Today, I think it went up around $70. But in the long run, it cannot go beyond 60 because if it goes up, then they will produce more shale. So this is why many countries that relied on oil in the past, like Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, Russia, Kazakhstan, have to re-engineer their economy because oil prices is not going to go to such high prices as before. But anyway, Russia economy is shrinking also. So as a result, in 2012, Russia GDP is $1.47 trillion, is actually a little bit smaller than South Korea. So this is a very peculiar situation because Russia is a superpower and they have a big voice in the military and foreign policy. But if you look at the economy backing those policies is very small, right? So I think the influence of Russia will become lower and lower in the future. But Russia, together with the former Soviet Union, still has quite a large GDP. So I'm going to skip a few and then now go to the Central Asian economy, because I know some of your countries students are from Kyrgyzstan. You can see the Kyrgyzstan economy did quite poorly in 2012, even compared with others. Like Kyrgyzstan minus 8%, Kazakhstan minus 2.6%, Ukraine minus 4.2%, but it's surprising Uzbekistan is 1.6%. Why? Because Uzbekistan relied on investment. They built roads and hospitals and investment factories in Uzbekistan rather than just exporting their commodity. Kyrgyzstan, why minus 8%? So this is a big issue because Kyrgyzstan economy is very much dependent on laborers who send money they go out to work and they send money back home. It's called the remittance economy. And it's very interesting to see that in Kyrgyzstan, this kind of remittance makes up 30% of GDP. So for example, most of the Kyrgyzstan young people, they go and work in Russia. And they send money back home, right, to Kyrgyzstan. And this makes up 30% of the GDP. Even some countries like Philippines, is 10% of GDP. So, but because of COVID, all the workers have to return to their country. So this remittance portion was drastically reduced. This is why Kyrgyzstan's economy had the largest minus in 2020. So even though Russia economy is not so big, they hire all of these people from the former Soviet Union, like Ukraine, Uzbekistan, Tajikistan. They work in Russia and they send money back home. So the Russian economy is still very, very important for Central Asia. Okay. And the countries with the largest outflow of people coming to work are like Russia, Korea, Germany, have lots of foreign workers. In fact, their foreign workers much more prefer to come to work in Korea because the Korean labor conditions, I think, is very fair to the foreign workers. So finally, let's look at the Asian economy. I know we have many students from the Asian countries. And you can see in 2012, Singapore has the biggest minus, and Malaysia, Indonesia, and Thailand is minus 6.1, as I said. Why? Because the Thai economy is very much dependent on tourism. So this is a statistic from Indonesian Bank. It shows that 25% of the Philippine economy is due to tourism. And more than 20% of the Thai economy is due to tourism. So in general, because of COVID and no travel, the Asian economies have not been doing well. But maybe this economy, Vietnam is maybe number 1 or number 2 in the world because they're plus 2.9% in 2020. Because as I said, many factories are now moving from China to Vietnam. And Vietnam is the beneficiary of the US-China trade conflict. So tourism is very important. And also there is lots of currency fluctuation in ASEAN. So this can be a very volatile because I know many Korean banks and Japanese banks are lending money to the Asian countries, and hopefully everything will work out. So I'm going to skip some of these slides. So these are more like detailed description of what's happening to these economies in 2012 because of COVID. And what you can see that Indonesia is putting out so much money to boost up the economy. But this means the government is going to have a larger debt. And so the government has a higher borrowing cost. Now this is the same in Korea. Unfortunately, because of COVID, the Korean government put out a lot of money, gave a lot of money, big budget. So if there are more money in the economy, what happens is you have a speculation. Like this is why the Korean stock market is going up. This is why the Korean real estate prices are going up. This is because of the COVID money, we say. Not because the economy is strong, but it's because of a lot of liquidity, which we say in specialized term, because of the liquidity in the market. So as a summary, we have to know that the business cycles are very active. As we saw, especially with the currency fluctuation, you can see that the currencies, they do not stay the same. They do not increase continuously or decrease. It always fluctuates a lot. That's why as a business person, you have to be very, very agile to what's going on. You don't need to know what's going to happen 5 years later. You need to know what's going to happen next year. Okay. And so also with like oil prices, also you have to try to predict these things. You also have to adapt. You as a young person, how should I make money? There's just 2 ways to make money. Let me tell you. One is you have to work. So this is one way to make money, right? The second way to make money is you have to invest. it's very difficult to be rich just by getting a salary. You have to invest. But if you want to invest, you need to know what's going on in this global economy. Another thing is that the COVID is going to accelerate the pace of digital transformation. People don't want to meet face to face. They want to be what's called untact business. So this is happening in all the industries, right? Like, for example, automobiles. What happened? Automobiles, the car companies they build cars in factories, but today, no. They close factories, they go into ride sharing, they go into mobility, and these kinds of different kinds of rental cars and services, right? So your business is constantly changing. Think about also a company like Uber. Uber started with giving rides, but now they have a very big portion of their revenue coming from food delivery. So business is always changing, and digital transformation is changing the business world. So as a young person, you have to understand the digital economy. And also, hopefully, you have to have some understanding of computers and AI. It's not easy. You cannot learn AI just from reading a newspaper. You have to, if you want to do AI, you have to study statistics, mathematics, computer science, and so on. So these are the big changes, what is called the platform economy today. And there's going to be lots of investment all over the world in health and biosciences. The Korean economy last year was upheld quite a lot by all these bio companies that make the COVID testing kits and various type of pharmaceuticals. And so this is also a very big area that you as a young person maybe consider it as a career. And another thing is, because of government debt, there's going to be a big instability because government spent too much money, and so there's going to be too much liquidity, so there's going to be a bubble. There's already a real estate bubble, there's already a stock market bubble. And what is the definition of a bubble? A bubble will always burst. There is no bubble that doesn't burst. And so I think the big lesson to learn from this is you should understand how the world is connected, what are the leading industries, what are the countries that are going to grow even more, and try to position your career accordingly. I hope this lecture was helpful. Thank you.